A confession from my childhood that still haunts me. A confession from my childhood that still haunts me. I've never told anyone this before, but I feel like it's been eating me alive for years, like something dark and poisonous that I can't keep inside any longer. It all started one summer when I was around 12, back when my parents used to send me to stay with my aunt in this tiny, almost forgotten town a few hours from the city. My aunt's house was an old colonial on the edge of a dense forest, and though it was beautiful, there was something unsettling about it. As a kid, I didn't really understand what bad vibes meant, but that house had them. There was a coldness in some of the rooms, especially the basement. My cousin David was a few years older than me, and though we'd never been particularly close, that summer he was suddenly my only companion. David was strange, though. He would stare at things too long, didn't laugh at any of my jokes, and had a way of drifting into silence mid-conversation, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. But I was 12, lonely, and eager to have any kind of connection, so I ignored all the red flags, chalked it up to him just being different. One afternoon, David asked if I wanted to go into the woods. There was supposed to be an abandoned cabin out there, somewhere deep among the trees, and he said he knew the way. The thing about the woods was they felt like a whole different world. As soon as we crossed the boundary from my aunt's yard, the temperature seemed to drop. The sounds of birds and bugs disappeared, leaving only an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. But David was determined, and I followed, pretending not to notice the unease settling in my stomach. We walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper, until the trees became so dense that barely any sunlight made it through. That's when we saw it. The cabin was old and half-collapsed, covered in moss and vines, hidden so well that you could pass by it 100 times and never see it unless you knew exactly where to look. David told me he'd found it last summer and never told anyone, that it was our secret. He was grinning like he'd just shown me the best surprise of my life, but I remember feeling a cold, prickling fear. I didn't want to go inside, but David grabbed my arm and pulled me in before I could protest. The cabin was dark and smelled of rot, mold, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was filled with strange things, dried-up animal bones scattered on the floor, weird symbols scratched into the walls, and, in the center, a small wooden box sitting on a makeshift altar. I wanted to leave, but David insisted we stay. He told me that he'd found the box last year and that there was something inside it, something powerful, something he hadn't dared to touch yet but wanted to show me. He had this wild look in his eyes, something intense and almost feverish that scared me more than anything else. Then he opened the box. Inside was a tiny, shriveled hand, no bigger than a baby's, curled into a claw-like shape and covered in some kind of dark, dried liquid. The smell hit me first. It was rancid, like old meat left in the sun. David told me it was the hand of the forest spirit, something he'd read about in some old book in my aunt's library, something he said would protect us if we made a pact with it. I wanted to run, but David grabbed my hand and told me to swear on the hand, to promise I'd keep the secret, that I'd never tell anyone about the cabin or the hand or what we were about to do. He said if we didn't swear, the spirit would get angry, and we'd be cursed. At that age, curses felt as real as anything else, so I nodded, whispered the words he told me to say, and let him press my hand onto the shriveled, leathery surface of that thing. It felt wrong, cold and hard, and it left this weird sticky residue on my skin. We left the cabin after that, and for the rest of the summer, David barely spoke to me, acted like nothing happened. I tried to forget it too, but the memory clung to me, lurking in the back of my mind, making it hard to sleep. I remember my mom asking why I'd become so quiet and withdrawn, but how could I explain? When I got back home after summer ended, things started happening. At first, it was small stuff. I'd hear my name whispered when no one was there, see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was just my imagination, that I was being silly, letting my mind play tricks on me. But then the dreams started. In every one, I was back in the cabin, standing before that tiny shriveled hand, only now it was alive, twitching, reaching out for me, whispering my name in this horrible, raspy voice. It got so bad I was afraid to sleep, started seeing the hand in every shadow, hearing it call to me even when I was wide awake. Then, one night, I woke up to find a small, red handprint on my arm, like someone had pressed their fingers into my skin while I slept. I ran to my parents, hysterical, showed them the mark, but they just brushed it off as a bruise or something I'd done to myself in my sleep. No one believed me, and eventually, I stopped telling anyone, kept it all inside. Years went by, and I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, that none of it was real. But then last week, I got a call from my aunt. David had gone missing. She said he'd been acting strange, withdrawn, obsessed with something he refused to talk about. He'd been going into the woods every night, and then one night, he just didn't come back. They searched everywhere, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. That night, the dreams returned, only now, they were worse. I saw David in the cabin, standing before that altar, whispering to the hand, begging it for something. His face was twisted, desperate, terrified, and then he looked at me, reached out, and screamed for help. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice still echoing in my head. Since then, the hauntings have become more intense. I'll catch glimpses of him in the mirror, his eyes hollow, pleading. I can hear the hand whispering in my dreams, telling me it's time, that I have to come back, that I have to finish what we started. I don't know what it wants from me, but I can feel it growing stronger, like it's getting closer every day. I'm terrified to go back to that town, to face whatever waits for me in the woods, but I know it's only a matter of time. Every night, I wake up with that same red handprint on my arm, fresh and raw, like a warning. I can feel it pulling me, calling me back to the cabin, to the hand, to the pact I made all those years ago. And the worst part is, deep down, I know I have to go back. Because if I don't, it's only a matter of time before it comes for me, before it drags me into the woods, just like it did with David. This is my confession, my curse, my childhood sin that still haunts me. I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I can feel it watching, waiting for the day I finally come back to finish what I started. I never thought I would find myself in a situation that seemed like it was ripped straight out of a horror movie, and yet here I am, typing this out in a darkened room, my only source of light flickering from my phone screen as if the universe is mocking me. This all started about 6 months ago when I moved into a new apartment in a pretty old building. It was a classic fixer-upper, full of creaks, strange noises, and a timeless charm that could easily be overshadowed by its unsettling ambience. You know, the kind of place where you feel like there's always someone watching you, even when you're alone. I always considered myself a private person, someone who kept their feelings and fears tucked away deep inside, only allowing the carefully curated aspects of my life to see the light of day. But the moment I discovered the power of vulnerability changed everything. It was a dreary Friday evening, and I was wrapped up in my usual routine of binge-watching way too many true crime documentaries. I had my takeout on the table beside me, comfortable in my isolation after an exhausting week. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through my apartment, cutting through the hum of the TV. My heart raced as I turned the volume down. The sound came from the old storage closet at the end of the hall. I live alone, and the thought of exploring the creepy closet in an unfamiliar place sent shivers down my spine. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably nothing. Just my imagination getting the best of me. Curiosity gnawed at me, however, and I eventually found myself standing in front of the door, the wood slightly warped from age. I grasped the handle, half expecting something to leap out at me. To my surprise, it opened easily, revealing a dark, dusty interior filled with a hodgepodge of forgotten furniture and boxes piled high. The shadows inside seemed to stretch and twist, and I shuddered. As I stepped inside, a chill swept over me, goosebumps breaking out on my skin. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on, illuminating the chaos within. That's when I saw her, a figure huddled in the corner, shrouded in shadows. I froze, feeling the earlier rush of adrenaline transform into a cold, paralyzing fear. The figure lifted her head slowly, and I saw her face, pale, gaunt, and tired. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, dark circles framing them like bruises. "Help me," she whispered, her voice cracking. My gut twisted. A voice in my head screamed to run, but I felt something, an inexplicable urge to reach out to her. "Who are you?" I stammered, instinctively taking a step back, as if distancing myself could protect me from whatever haunting sorrow cloaked her. I'm lost," she replied, her voice barely audible, weaving through the stillness of the closet like the faintest wind. "Please. I need to feel again." I blinked, confusion swirling in my thoughts. What did that even mean? But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that this wasn't just a manifestation of despair. There was something palpable, almost magnetic, drawing me closer to her pain. In that moment, something inside me cracked open, a floodgate of vulnerability pouring into the space between us. The urge to flee dissipated, replaced with a willingness to understand, an overwhelming desire to share my own burden. I stepped closer, the weight of my own emotional armor feeling heavier than ever. "I know what it's like to feel lost," I murmured, and to my surprise, the connection between us began to intensify. I'm scared. Of so many things. I don't always know how to deal with it." She nodded slowly, as if every word I spoke resonated with her. "Then you understand," she said softly. "That fear. It wraps around you like a tight noose. The darkness feels safe, but in that safety, you forget how to truly live." Those words pierced me, each syllable reverberating in my chest. I was holding on to my fear like a lifeline, convinced that if I let go, I would drown in the chaos of raw emotion. With each passing second, I found myself stripping away my fears like layers of clothing, revealing the raw flesh of my insecurities beneath. "It's hard for me, sharing myself with anyone," I admitted, my voice trembling. "What if I get hurt? What if they reject me?" She smiled gently, the faintest glimmer of understanding shining through her haunted expression. "Vulnerability is strength," she said, "not a weakness. When you allow yourself to be seen, to be known, you invite connection. You invite healing." Slowly, it dawned on me that she wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a ghost haunting my closet, she was a reflection of all the parts of myself I had neglected. In that dusty, dimly lit closet, surrounded by lost belongings and sorrow, something shifted within me. I understood then that vulnerability didn't signify defeat, it was the first step toward embracing everything I truly was. I finally saw the truth in her face. We were both lost souls, yearning for solace. Gathering my courage, I reached out, brushing my fingertips against her hand, a simple, fleeting gesture. Our connection sparked a warmth that spread through the darkness, dispelling the cold chill fear had wrapped around me for so long. In that instant, I understood the power of vulnerability. No longer was it a monster hiding in the shadows, it was the light illuminating the path toward healing. We sat there together, sharing our fears and dreams, peeling back the layers we had hidden away for far too long. Time lost all meaning, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged, both to her and to myself. Hours passed before I reluctantly pulled away, knowing I couldn't remain in the closet forever. I returned to the familiar glow of my TV, but something felt different. The heaviness in my chest had lifted. I was lighter, freer. I began sharing my journey with the world around me, friends, co-workers, even online communities. I discovered that each time I spoke my truth, I not only released my fears but also invited others to do the same. I realized there was power in vulnerability because, in opening ourselves up, we create spaces for others to find their voices, too. Today, as I type this out, I'm no longer that terrified person living in isolation. I've found strength in my vulnerability, and I promise you it won't lead you to darkness, but instead, it'll guide you toward a connection that transcends the mundane. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost or alone, remember, vulnerability is a superpower. Embrace it, wield it, and you might just uncover a world waiting to welcome you. It had been over 20 years since I last saw Sarah, my childhood friend. We shared everything back then, the treehouse we built, the secrets we whispered, and the adventures that seemed to stretch on forever. But life happened, and we lost touch after families moved away and high schools pulled us in different directions. I often thought of those days, but I never knew how much I missed her until I stumbled into that forgotten corner of my hometown, the old park where we used to play. It felt surreal, like stepping into a faded photograph, every detail tinted with nostalgia and dust. The swings looked rusty, the grass was overgrown, but the slide was still there, the paint peeling but the memories intact. I decided to sit on one of the swings, letting the cool breeze wash over me as I reminisced. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice behind me. "I see you found your way back." I turned, my heart racing, and there stood Sarah. She was older, of course, but I recognized her instantly. Time hadn't altered the spark in her eyes, it still shone with the mischief and joy I remembered. We embraced, an awkward yet genuine reunion, and soon we were laughing like no time had passed at all. "Can you believe it's been so long?" she said, those words tumbling out like a floodgate releasing a tide of memories. As we chatted about our lives, I felt a strange chill creep in as night began to fall. Sarah looked around, a frown creasing her brow. "You ever feel like something's watching?" I chuckled, trying to brush it off, but unease settled in my gut. The trees around the park began to sway, almost as if they had a life of their own. Sarah's expression turned serious, and she whispered, "You know about the stories, right?" I didn't. She said that years ago, not long after we'd stopped coming to the park, a boy had gone missing here. They never found him, and the park had become notorious, called the haunted playground by kids with nothing better to do. Strange sounds would echo through the trees at night, and a sense of dread hung in the air, but I didn't believe in ghosts. We decided to explore anyway, compelled by a mix of nostalgia and adrenaline. We wandered deeper into the park, where shadows seemed to grow longer. Sarah recounted the tales from our childhood while I interrupted with harmless jokes, trying to lighten the atmosphere. Then, we stumbled upon an old, derelict building at the back of the park, the remains of the community center where we once participated in summer camps. The windows were shattered, the doors seemed ajar, and the air was thick with an unsettling silence. "Let's go in," she proposed with a challenge in her voice. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Inside, memories flooded back, echoes of laughter, the smell of summer campfires, and the faint taste of burnt marshmallows. But the eeriness in the air was tangible. Each step on the creaky floorboards felt like they were matched by something lurking just beyond my vision. As we moved deeper into the center, Sarah's demeanor shifted, she seemed tense, and I noticed her shivering despite the warm air. "Hey, it's just an old building," I joked, trying to ease her fears, but she remained unresponsive. And then, in a moment of quiet, we both heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, floating through the still air. It was a child's voice, calling our names. I felt my heart drop. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Sarah nodded, eyes wide. "We should leave," she urged, but I was rooted in place, partly from the shock and partly from an inexplicable pull toward the voice. "We can't just ignore it," I insisted. "We need to see if someone's in trouble." And against her protest, I led the way, following the sound down a dark corridor. The walls were peeling, and the air grew colder with every step. The whispers became clearer, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to answer. The voice wasn't just calling, it was beckoning us deeper into the unknown. We reached a room at the far end, the door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside was the old basement, dark, dank, and utterly foreboding. My heart raced, and I scanned the room frantically. Then I saw him. A child stood there, about 6 years old, with wide, ghostly eyes. He looked startlingly familiar. "Help me," he whispered, reaching out towards us. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Instinctively, I knew he was somehow connected to Sarah. "This is the boy," I exclaimed, my voice shaking. "This is the boy who went missing." Panic surged through me as I turned to Sarah. She looked pale, lost in a trance as she whispered, "It's you." Confusion clouded my mind. "What do you mean it's me?" But she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer to the child, mesmerized. "We were supposed to play together, remember?" she murmured, and my stomach sank. The child's image flickered, as if reality struggled to grasp him. "Sarah, no," I shouted, pulling her back away from him. That seemed to break the spell. The child's expression was filled with an unearthly sadness as he began to fade. "Don't go. I'm sorry." Sarah screamed, and in that moment, something shifted in the air, a palpable tension curling like smoke. The cold intensified, and the whispers escalated into frantic cries. Suddenly, with a blinding flash, the room erupted in chaos, laughter, cries of despair, echoes of a lost time. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the door as reality caved in around us. We barely made it out of the building as everything imploded behind us, the whispers swallowed by the night. The park was desolate now, cold and empty, the rusted swings creaking as if laughing at our foolishness. We stumbled back to the entrance, my heart racing. "What was that?" I asked, breathless. Sarah looked dazed. "He needed me. I've forgotten. I shouldn't have let you pull me away." I turned to her, confusion washing over me. "Forgotten what?" But, instead of answering, she turned, glancing back at the park, a wistfulness in her gaze. "I shouldn't have come back." I watched as she slowly began to fade, her form blurring like a memory in the wind. "No. Sarah, don't. Please." I reached for her, but it was too late. She vanished completely, leaving me alone in a quiet, empty park. The night stretched on, and I felt the weight of the stories, the lost boy, the friends who disappeared. I ran, my feet pounding against the dirt path, desperate to escape the place that had held too many ghosts. I made it to my car and drove away, heart racing, wondering if I would ever understand what had really happened. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing at the edge of the park, watching me leave. I could still see the spark in her eyes, lingering like a haunting echo of our childhood, a bittersweet reminder of the friendship that had been lost, and the darkness that waited just beyond the margins of memory. I never imagined I would stumble upon the joy of gardening in the way I did. It started innocently enough one restless night when I found myself browsing through old family photos. My grandmother appeared in a faded snapshot, dirt under her fingernails, her face illuminated by the sun, surrounded by orange marigolds and lush green leaves. I'd spent my childhood summers at her house, watching her tend to her plants with a care I'd never understood at the time. That night, nostalgia washed over me, igniting something I hadn't felt in years, a longing for simplicity, for grounding. On a whim, I decided I would try my hand at gardening. With a sense of urgency, the following day I headed to a local nursery. The bright colors of flowers and the assorted shrubs felt overwhelming. I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as I navigated through the aisles. I bought a few potted herbs, basil, rosemary, and mint, and a pack of marigold seeds my grandmother used to grow. I didn't have a yard, just a small balcony in my apartment, but it was enough, I thought, to create something beautiful. I returned home and set everything up, arranging pots along the balcony railing under the afternoon sun. I felt exhilarated, like an artist finally standing before a blank canvas. For the first few weeks, it felt like therapy. I watered my plants daily, talking to them as if they could understand, coaxing them to grow. It wasn't long before I noticed small sprouts pushing through the soil. In that moment, I felt a sense of triumph that I had never experienced before. Yet, as weeks turned into months, something strange began to unfold. My once vibrant balcony garden started growing in ways I couldn't explain. The marigolds thrived almost aggressively, each flower bursting with color, but there were peculiarities. They seemed to flourish with such fervor that it almost felt unnatural. Other neighbors would comment on how beautiful my balcony looked, and I found myself glowing from their compliments. Then, one night, I was drawn to the window as I heard a soft humming sound, like a lullaby carried by the breeze. Curiosity piqued, I stepped outside and was enveloped in an otherworldly scene. My marigolds glowed faintly under the moonlight, pulsating gently as if they were breathing. The air felt thick, rich with an unseen energy. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was dreaming, but when I looked again, the flowers shimmered brighter, and I felt a strange connection, a tugging sensation in my chest. I spent the next few nights in awe, witnessing the flowers dance in rhythm with the hums that filled the air. It was intoxicating. I began to feel as though I was a part of something greater, something alive within the earth. The joy of gardening transformed into an obsession that went deeper than aesthetics or flavor. I soon learned about the lore of plants and their mystical connections to nature. The marigolds became my focus. I discovered ancient beliefs surrounding them, a symbol of protection, often planted to ward off negativity. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were guarding something, or perhaps, revealing secrets. But with every flower that bloomed, something shifted. One evening, while tending to the plants, I noticed a figure out of the corner of my eye. When I turned, I saw a shadowy woman standing on the balcony next door. She wore a long, tattered dress that danced in the wind like the marigolds, her face obscured by wild hair. She stared intently at my plants, her body swaying slightly. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. When I blinked, she had vanished. Shaking it off, I turned back to my garden, but the humming had changed. It felt darker now, no longer a soothing melody but a chaotic dissonance that vibrated through my bones. The next day, I decided to confront the strangeness head-on. I approached my neighbor. She seemed harmless enough at first, her voice soft and hesitant. She introduced herself as Esme, an avid gardener, and when I mentioned my marigolds, her demeanor shifted. A knowing look crossed her face, and she warned me about the nature spirits said to inhabit flowers, particularly marigolds. They can come alive if treated with the right care, she said cryptically. But don't let them take too much. Her words echoed in my mind as I returned home, unease creeping in. My once delightful garden began to take on an ominous presence. The marigolds bloomed so profusely that they choked out the herbs. I felt my connection to the plants shift, their vibrant hues turning thorny, their energy turning possessive. Esme's warning echoed deeper. I wondered what I had conjured with my newfound hobby. I attempted to remove the marigolds, thinking I could rein in whatever strange magic I had awakened, but it was as if they had taken root in my very soul. Each attempt to uproot them caused me pain, an ache in my chest as if the flowers were writhing in protest. Desperation surged as I realized I was losing control. With every passing day, I found myself more entranced by their glow, by the energy that seemed to pulse through my apartment. I stopped inviting friends over, growing more reclusive, and the humming became a dreadful dirge, pulling me from sleep, beckoning me into the moonlit world of my plants. The marigolds seemed to whisper now, their breath carried on the evening breeze, calling me to listen closely, to heed their song. I felt tethered to them, caught between joy and terror. One night, under a blood-red moon, the humming crescendoed, guiding me to the marigolds as they swirled and fluttered with a kaleidoscope of light. Frantic, I reached toward them, wishing to strip away the veil they hung between who I was and this strange new reality. As I touched the flowers, the world went dark. I woke to find myself surrounded by the marigold garden, but it was so much larger now, stretching beyond what my balcony had ever contained. The flowers loomed, shimmering with an iridescent glow, their hum rising towards a pitch that filled the entire air. I was no longer just observing my plants, I was a part of their world, and in that moment, I understood, the marigolds had absorbed everything I poured into them, turning my love into something primal and uncontrollable. They had awakened, inviting me to take a path that couldn't be undone. I had discovered the joy of gardening, but at what cost? I could feel my will fading against their power. That's when I realized I was trapped between fascination and fear, and all I could do was watch as the marigolds danced around me in an ecstatic frenzy, my heart racing as I was pulled deeper into their vibrant embrace. So, if you stumble upon an overly vibrant garden, take heed, there may be a joy lurking in the shadows that you're not prepared to uncover. A night out that went terribly wrong, the aftermath. A night out that went terribly wrong started innocently enough with a casual text from my friend Jason suggesting we grab drinks at a new bar downtown. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions that seemed harmless, a quick escape from the monotony of the work week. I'd been feeling cooped up lately, buried in deadlines and routine, so the idea of loosening up a bit, laughing over a few beers with Jason, sounded like exactly what I needed. We met up around 9 at this dimly lit spot called The Hideout, a place that had only opened recently but was already famous for its strange decor and even stranger clientele. Jason was waiting for me by the bar, grinning as he raised his glass in a mock toast, already 2 drinks in by the time I got there. The night began as a blur of laughter, stories, and drinks. It felt like one of those nights that would be ordinary, maybe even forgettable, a few hours of escape in the midst of life's grind. But then Jason started talking about this party he'd heard about, a secret rave a few blocks away. I didn't know it at the time, but saying yes to that suggestion would be a mistake, the kind of mistake that changes you forever. We stumbled out of the bar and down a series of side streets, following vague directions Jason had picked up from some guy he'd met at the bar. The city felt unusually quiet, and as we moved away from the main streets, the buildings around us seemed to grow taller, looming over us in a way that felt eerie in the night silence. We finally found ourselves standing in front of an unmarked door, behind which loud, pulsing music thumped like a heartbeat, shaking the walls. I should have listened to that small voice in the back of my head telling me to turn back, but instead, I followed Jason inside, the thrill of the unknown urging me forward. The room we entered was dark, with flashing neon lights and shadows cast everywhere, distorted faces and bodies blending into the crowd, all moving to the rhythm. There was something off about the energy in the room, an edge of desperation in the way people were dancing, like they were losing themselves, escaping reality in a way that felt too intense, too all-consuming. Jason disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, leaving me stranded among strangers who seemed to look right through me, their faces glazed over, empty in a way I couldn't quite place. I tried to find him, pushing through the crowd, calling his name, but the music drowned out everything else, pulsing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. The smell of sweat and smoke filled the air, and the longer I stayed, the more claustrophobic I felt, trapped in a place that seemed to pulse with some unspoken dread. Just as I was about to give up and head out, someone grabbed my arm, their grip too tight, pulling me through the crowd. I turned, expecting to see Jason or maybe someone trying to be friendly, but it was A man I'd never seen before, his face half lit by the neon lights, his eyes wide and frantic. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper over the music, saying something about leaving, about how it wasn't safe. I tried to pull away, thinking he was just some drunk guy, but he held on, his grip tightening as he repeated himself, his words tinged with an urgency that cut through the fog of the night. You need to get out. This place isn't what you think it is. He looked over his shoulder, his face paling as he glanced at something behind him, his eyes widening in fear. They're watching. With that, he let go of me, melting back into the crowd before I could ask what he meant. I was shaken, the initial thrill of the night giving way to a creeping sense of dread that settled in my gut. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of the people around me, their faces strange and unfamiliar, their expressions vacant yet intense. The energy in the room had shifted, and it felt like everyone was moving in sync, like puppets on strings, their movements too perfect, too coordinated. I tried to find the exit, but the more I searched, the more disoriented I felt, the lights and shadows warping my sense of direction. It was like the walls were closing in, the room shifting in a way that defied logic, every path I took leading me further into the crowd. I finally spotted Jason near the back, his face pale, his eyes wide as he stood frozen, staring at something just out of view. I pushed my way over to him, calling his name, but he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on whatever he was looking at, his body tense, almost paralyzed. I followed his line of sight, my stomach dropping as I realized what he was staring at, a group of people, standing in a perfect circle, their heads bowed, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was low, rhythmic, almost like a chant, filling the air with an unnatural chill. I grabbed Jason's arm, shaking him, trying to snap him out of it, but he didn't move, his expression vacant, like he was in a trance. Panic set in, my heart racing as I looked around, realizing that more people were gathering, forming circles all around us, their voices joining the whispering chant. The sound grew louder, filling my head, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I felt trapped, like I was being pulled into something dark and ancient, something that defied explanation. I yanked Jason's arm harder, finally breaking him out of his trance, and together we stumbled through the crowd, pushing our way toward what I hoped was the exit. The whispers followed us, the sound echoing in my mind, even as we burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were blocks away, the silence of the empty streets a stark contrast to the suffocating noise we'd left behind. Jason was shaking, his face pale, and when I asked him what he'd seen, he just shook his head, unable to put it into words. We never talked about that night again, and neither of us dared to go back to that part of town. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, that low, rhythmic chant echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night that went terribly wrong, a night that left a mark on both of us, one that would never fade. My boss expects me to work on my wedding day, should I quit? It all started as a dream job, a position I had worked tirelessly to secure. The thrill of working in a fast-paced marketing agency was intoxicating, and I poured my heart and soul into every project. But as my wedding day approached, everything began to unravel. My fiancé, Jake, and I had spent months planning the perfect ceremony, poring over every detail, and visualizing the day we would finally say I do. I was ecstatic, ready to celebrate the love we had built together. However, just 2 weeks before the big day, I received a chilling email from my boss, Kelly. It was a reminder about an important client meeting scheduled for the same day as my wedding. My stomach dropped. I was hopeful that it was just a misunderstanding, so I replied, politely requesting to reschedule. But when I approached Kelly in person, I was met with a steely gaze. "You're the lead on this project. We can't afford to lose momentum, especially with this client," she said. "You have to be there." I felt the walls closing in. "But it's my wedding day, Kelly. I can't just cancel or push it back. It's important to me and my family." Her expression didn't change. "I understand, but this is a crucial time for our company. You can't let your personal life interfere with your work responsibilities." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt a mixture of frustration and helplessness. I had always been committed to my job, often going above and beyond. But this felt different. This was my wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I couldn't wrap my head around the idea of having to choose between my career and my personal happiness. I went home that night, feeling utterly defeated. I tried to talk to Jake about it, hoping he would support me. But when I explained the situation, his brow furrowed with concern. This isn't just a job, honey. You love what you do, and I know how hard you've worked for this position. Maybe it's worth considering what Kelly said. I couldn't believe my ears. You think I should skip my wedding for a client meeting? Jake, this is our day. I've dreamed about it since I was a little girl, he sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm not saying that. But you don't want to burn bridges either. Can't you find a way to make it work? I felt torn, the pressure of expectations weighing heavily on my shoulders. I spent the next few days in turmoil, trying to find a solution. I reached out to colleagues for advice, hoping someone would have a suggestion that could help me navigate this mess. But everyone seemed to echo the same sentiment: you can't risk your career over one day. It felt like a betrayal, and I began to question the loyalty of my coworkers. Each day that passed brought more anxiety, and I found myself constantly refreshing my email, waiting for any sign of understanding from Kelly. The day before the wedding, I decided to go in early, hoping to catch Kelly and explain my side one last time. The office was eerily quiet, and I could feel the tension in the air as I approached her office. When I knocked, she looked up from her computer, a mixture of surprise and irritation crossing her face. What is it, Jenna? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. I just wanted to ask if there's any way we can reschedule the meeting. I understand the importance, but it's my wedding day, and I really can't miss it, Kelly sighed, her patience wearing thin. I've told you before, this is non-negotiable. You need to put your priorities straight. This is a pivotal moment for our company, and I expect you to act accordingly. I felt my heart sink. I can't believe you're saying this. You're really going to make me choose between my job and my wedding? She shrugged, completely unfazed. You've made your choice by being here. Just know that if you're not there, it will reflect poorly on you. I stormed out of her office, a mix of anger and despair swirling inside me. I had been pushed to the limit, and I felt betrayed by a company I had devoted myself to. When I got home, I couldn't hold back the tears. What am I going to do? I sobbed, and Jake pulled me into a comforting embrace. You have to stand up for yourself, Jenna. You can't let them dictate your life. His words ignited a fire within me. I was tired of feeling like a puppet on strings, forced to dance to the whims of someone else's expectations. That night, I made a decision. I didn't want to live with the regret of sacrificing my happiness for a job that wouldn't hesitate to replace me. I drafted my resignation letter, pouring my heart into it. I explained that I loved my job but couldn't compromise my personal life for the sake of a client meeting. I felt a sense of empowerment wash over me as I clicked send. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter, but also nervous about the repercussions. I still had to face Kelly, and I couldn't shake the anxiety of what would happen next. As I arrived at the office, I steeled myself for the confrontation. Kelly's expression was one of fury as I walked into her office, the resignation email still fresh in her inbox. You think you can just walk away like this? She snapped. You're making a huge mistake. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. No, I'm making the right choice for myself. I won't sacrifice my wedding day for a meeting. She leaned forward, her voice low and threatening. You'll regret this. Do you really think you can find a job that respects your priorities? You're going to be labeled as unreliable. I stood my ground, feeling a sense of clarity. I'd rather be unemployed than work for someone who doesn't value my personal life. I want to live my life on my own terms. Her face reddened in anger, but I turned on my heel and left her office, a sense of finality in my decision echoing in my heart. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free. I spent the next few days finalizing wedding details, soaking in the joy and excitement. On the day of the wedding, as I stood in my gown, surrounded by family and friends, I felt a profound sense of happiness. Jake looked at me with so much love, and in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. We exchanged vows, pledging our lives to each other, and every worry about work faded into the background. I had taken a stand for myself and chosen love over corporate expectations. In the weeks that followed, I started a new chapter in my career, one that aligned with my values and priorities. I found a job that appreciated my contributions and recognized the importance of work-life balance. Looking back, I realized that sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the most rewarding outcomes. If you're reading this and find yourself in a similar situation, remember, your happiness and personal life should never take a backseat to someone else's expectations. Always prioritize what matters most, and never be afraid to stand up for yourself, even if it means making tough decisions. I never believed in the whole find your inner peace nonsense. To me, it sounded like a catchy phrase used to sell scented candles and overpriced yoga mats. But after a stressful year, complete with a grueling job, a breakup, and the constant hum of self-doubt, I figured I had nothing to lose. That's how I found myself in a small, nondescript yoga studio just a few blocks from my apartment, the kind of place you might walk past without a second glance. The studio was dimly lit, infused with that overly calming aroma that somehow felt a bit too artificial, the flickering candles casting spooky shadows against the peeling paint. As I signed in, the instructor, a lean woman with long, flowing hair, smiled at me with a warmth that made me both comforted and uneasy. Her eyes had an unsettling depth, as if she could see right through me. "Welcome," she said softly. "You're here to find peace, right?" My gut twisted, but I nodded, hoping no one would notice my nervousness. The classes began with a kind of meditative breathing that I found painfully mundane. I kept glancing at the clock as the seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. I didn't feel any different, and with every pose I struggled to hold, my inner cynic only grew louder, mocking the whole experience. But then came the final pose, the Shavasana, where we were instructed to lie flat on our backs, letting go of everything, both physically and mentally. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but the thoughts kept pouring in like a raging river: bills, work, loneliness. And then, as if someone flipped a switch in my brain, my surroundings faded into darkness. When I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the studio. Instead, I found myself in a lush, dense forest, the smell of pine thick in the air. Confusion washed over me, and I sat up, taking in my surroundings. The trees towered above me, their leaves whispering secrets only they could understand. It felt so real, almost too real, and I could hear a soft trickle of water nearby. Driven by curiosity, I followed the sound and soon stumbled upon a pristine stream, its water crystal clear and alive with movement. Kneeling beside it, I splashed my face, feeling the refreshingly cold water wake me up from a stupor. Just then, I noticed something glimmering beneath the surface, an object glowing faintly like a small orb. Without thinking, I reached down and grabbed it, bringing it up to my face. The moment I touched it, everything around me shifted and started to blur. I gripped the orb tighter, feeling an energy surge through me, and in an instant, I was transported again, this time to a cramped room filled with the scent of incense and dim candlelight. It was the yoga studio, but everyone was gone. I was alone now, the class empty, as that same instructor watched me from a distance, her expression unreadable. "You have found something special," she said in that low, melodic voice that echoed around the room. "The orb is a gateway, a conduit to true clarity. Use it wisely." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" I managed to stammer. "To find your true self, you must first face your fears," she said, her gaze piercing through me. "You've only begun to scratch the surface of your potential." I felt a shiver run through me. I had always buried my fears deep down, masking them with sarcasm and a facade of indifference. "You must reflect, and only then will you find the peace you seek," she continued. I wanted to argue, to push back against her preachiness, but her words filled me with a strange sense of urgency. I was jolted forward into a series of scenes, my memories playing out in rapid succession, all the moments of pain I had tried to bury. I confronted the day my father left us, the heartbreak of my first love, and the times I felt utterly alone in a crowded room. Each memory sank into me like a heavy stone, forcing me to confront the realities I had been avoiding all this time. I screamed, trying to escape the chain of memories, but I was trapped, each painful moment intertwining with the next, feeling more vivid than before. Suddenly, everything around me froze, and I was back in the deserted studio, breathless and trembling. The instructor stood closer now, that same serene smile on her face. "You see, the path to inner peace is not without its trials," she said, almost proudly. "You're not meant to escape these experiences, you are meant to embrace them." I gritted my teeth, wanting to argue that embracing pain was overrated, but something inside told me she was right. I clutched the orb tighter, feeling the energy flow through me again. The memories, while painful, were also mine, pieces of a puzzle that told my story. The instructor gestured for me to let it go. only then will you see your path forward. With all my might, I threw the orb into the air. It burst into thousands of shimmering particles, filling the room with light. The particles swirled around me, enveloping me, and for a moment, I felt weightless, as if my spirit had detached from my body. It was intoxicating, freeing, enlightening. And when the light finally faded, I felt different. Returning to the forest, everything was crisp and bright, yet eerily serene. I noticed the colors were more vivid, the air felt more alive. I began walking again, now aware of the whispers from the trees, each one a story, a warning, a piece of wisdom. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and inviting, and for the first time, I truly appreciated my surroundings, the beauty that existed just outside my bubble of self-pity. Suddenly, a deer leapt in front of me, its eyes wide and bright, but instead of fleeing, it looked straight into my own. In that moment, I realized I was part of something much larger, a rhythm, a flow that tied all living things together. Time lost its grip on me as I roamed the forest, searching for clues, facing my fears one last time. I leaned heavily on my breath, not the shallow gasps that anxiety often brought, but deep, expansive breaths filled with intention. Minutes felt like hours, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting shades of orange and purple across the sky, I returned to that shimmering stream. Kneeling once more, I cupped my hands to drink, savoring the cool, refreshing water. As I stood, I caught my reflection in the stream, and for the first time, I saw someone I could respect, a person willing to face their truth. The final moment came swift. I found myself back in the yoga studio, surrounded by my classmates who looked at me, eyes sparkling with an entirely different energy. "Welcome back," the instructor said knowingly. I didn't respond, but I felt lighter, a weight lifted from my shoulders, the warmth of acceptance wrapping around me. The class ended like any other, but for me, it was profoundly different. I didn't leave that studio the same person who walked in. I had faced my fears, embraced my pain, and discovered the truth hidden beneath it all. I felt unusually alive, and as I left, I caught a glimpse of the world around me, vibrant, raw, and beautifully chaotic. I smiled knowingly, embracing my newfound perspective. Inner peace wasn't a place I arrived at, it was simply a decision to face my reality as it came, beautifully imperfect, unbearably honest. That night, as I laid in bed, I closed my eyes and exhaled. Peace enveloped me, whispering promises of brighter tomorrows. I drifted off, knowing the journey was just beginning. Who knew how many other unexpected paths awaited, and how often I'd need to return to that little studio to rediscover it? I never thought I would find myself in a situation that would test my very core, but life, as it often does, had a way of turning the mundane into the extraordinary. It all started about a year ago when I moved into a seemingly perfect little house out in the countryside. It was a charming old place, with creaky floorboards and a garden that had long been neglected. The first few weeks were nothing short of blissful. Tranquility enveloped me like a warm blanket, and I thought I had found my sanctuary. However, it didn't take long for the idyllic facade to fade. It began with minor disturbances, shadows flickering just out of sight, whispers that tickled my ears while I was trying to sleep. But I brushed them off as a manifestation of my imagination or the result of living alone for the first time. One stormy night, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. My heart raced as I crept down the hallway, each step echoing in the eerie silence. When I reached the living room, I found my old cassette player, an antique that I had yet to set up, laying on the floor. The lid popped open and an old tape had ejected itself. Curious, I picked it up and noticed it had someone's name written on it, Lily. I tucked the tape in my pocket and decided to investigate later. After all, it could just be an old relic left over from the previous owner. That night, the events escalated. I heard soft crying echoing from what I later learned was supposed to be the attic. As the tears threaded through the wooden beams, fear cascaded down my spine, and I found myself frozen. Was someone hiding up there? The rational part of me screamed to call the police, but curiosity and a strange, twisted feeling drew me toward the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow staircase, every creak amplifying my trepidation. Upon reaching the attic door, I hesitated. The crying had stopped, leaving only silence that draped over me like a shroud. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The space was dim, filled with cobwebs and dust, but as my flashlight swept across the room, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A small doll lay in the center of the attic, its porcelain skin cracked, eyes eerily staring up at me. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to approach it, as if it held some part of my fate. As I reached down to pick it up, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the air thickened, my breath becoming visible against the oppressive darkness. But before I could touch the doll, a shrill voice shattered the silence, "Don't." I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an old trunk. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, thinking that maybe I could record this peculiarity. As I dialed for help, I saw the light from my flashlight flicker, the beam dancing erratically across the room until it finally went out. Panic surged through me. Alone in a dark attic with an unseen entity. My mind raced with the worst possible scenarios. I switched on my phone's flashlight. It wasn't as powerful, but it cast a thin beam of light that slowly revealed the contours of the ghostly room. That's when I saw it. The doll was gone. In a fit of adrenaline, I darted back down the stairs and bolted the door behind me. I had to leave. My rational mind urged me to just flee, but the nagging wonder gripped at me. What was Lily and why was I feeling so tethered to her? I decided to brave it out and find the cassette tape I had pocketed that evening. I set up the old player, fingers trembling, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The tape hissed to life, the grainy sound evoking the distant echoes of a long-forgotten time. A voice crackled through the speakers, soft and haunting like a lullaby. "Help me," it whispered. "I can't leave until I find my doll." My stomach flip-flopped. Slowly, the story began to unravel, a tragic tale of a girl named Lily who disappeared mysteriously decades ago, the doll being her beloved companion. The voice meandered through memories of laughter, childhood dreams, and then dulled to darkness, revealing ominous occurrences that had cursed the doll ever since Lily vanished. The unease began to morph into a resolve. I had to find the doll. I could feel Lily reaching out to me, beckoning me to help her. The next day, I researched the history of the house, the land it sat upon, and the disappearance of Lily. The locals were hesitant to talk, giving half-hearted answers, wary of bringing up ancient rumors. But one elderly lady finally opened up, recounting tales of spirits trapped in time, lingering until someone unlocked the door to their final resting place. "You have to break the curse," she warned. "You must discover her truth." Armed with this desperation, I returned to the attic with fresh resolve, carrying the now ominous feeling of the old doll lingering on my mind. I climbed the staircase, breathing in the dusty air, the ominous feeling tingling at my senses. "Lily, I'm here to help you," I whispered, hoping against hope that my voice could somehow bridge the gap between our worlds. But it was the same chilling quiet that met me. I searched high and low, and just as doubt began to cloud my determination, I noticed a glimmer beneath the floorboards. Kneeling down, I pried open a loose plank, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a delicate, tarnished locket. I grasped it with trembling fingers, the unlocking of the past weighing heavily upon me. As I opened it, I found a faded photograph of a girl who looked just like the doll, but younger. There was Lily, smiling back at me as if I had unearthed a piece of her soul. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, the walls creaked, and shadows swirled. I felt a presence, an overwhelming warmth engulfed me, and a whisper brushed against my ear, "Thank you." I felt a release, a weight lifted, and the room brightened. It was in that moment I realized I hadn't just unearthed a doll, but I had reached for a lost soul. I stumbled back, overwhelmed. The darkness didn't feel suffocating anymore. I emerged from the attic and watched as light broke through the windows, illuminating the ghostly corners. I felt different. I had confronted my fears, faced the unknown, and helped a spirit find peace. Recovery wasn't just a release, it was a transformation. That experience didn't just break down walls within me, it rebuilt them stronger, fortified with the knowledge that facing fears leads to incredible revelations. Today, I realize that scared little girl inside me doesn't have to stay hidden, she can emerge stronger. I learned that adversity isn't a shackle, it's a stepping stone leading us toward our truth. Sharing this story has opened a door, offering solace to countless others who feel weighed down by shadows, reminding them that there's strength within the struggle.